Assalamu alaikum. So we are about to bring our keynote speaker in. So if I request everybody to settle down in the next 30 seconds. Yeah, thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you and welcome to Habib University. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening. If I could just ask everybody to take a second to turn off your cell phones. If you have a cell phone, to please turn it off and mute it. We're going to get, my name is Chris Taylor, and I'm the Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean of the Faculty here at Habib University. And we're going to start with Tilawat al-Quran, from a reading, a recitation from Surah Al-Alaq. And I'm very pleased to ask one of our students from the class of 2020, Fazlur Rahman, who's a student in electrical engineering, to come up for Tilawat al-Quran.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم كلا إن الإنسان ليطغى أن رآه استغنى إن إلى ربك الرجعى. Translation. In the name of Allah, the gracious, the merciful. Recite in the name of your Lord who created man from a clot. Recite, and your Lord is the most generous. He who taught by the pen taught man that which he knew not. No, indeed, man transgresses, because he sees himself self-sufficient. Indeed, to your Lord is your return. صدق الله العظيم.
And now it's my great pleasure to invite the president of Habib University and the visionary who is really behind the idea of Habib University to the stage to say a few words about the Yohsin lecture series.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Distinguished guests of Board of Governors, Board of Directors of Habib University, students, faculty, and of course our fifth Yohsin speaker, Dr. Reza Aslan, welcome. We had a class of 2019 dinner a couple of days ago, and I touted the overcompensation of a guilty parent for a second child example to them, right? This is essentially taking from the famous TV show When I Was Young, Friends, when Ross and Monica's parents, or his dad especially, trying to overcompensate for neglecting Monica, gave her his Porsche. So this Porsche treatment continues for you. That we have one of the most important voices of sanity in today's world, Reza, who is going to be talking to you not once, but twice. So you better be happy now, right? This year's lecture is hosted by our School of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. We have this tradition in Yohsin lecture that it is alternated between Dhanani School of Science and Engineering and School of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. Curiously, though, that School of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences seem to really like Iranian Americans. So this is the second one that they have found to come and speak. So let's see what they bring in the next time. The lecture is titled Yohsin. Yohsin is derived from, right here, قيمة كل امرئ ما يحسنه. Husn, Ihsan, Ahsan, Hasan. And the key, one of the key terms that I'm going to focus on is beauty and grace. Looking at the corpus of Reza Aslan's engagements, whether it's his phenomenal books or frequent appearances in sometimes chaotic media, one can't help but see the intensity of passion with which Reza makes his points, but with the requisite grace and beauty. So I can't think of a more appropriate Yohsin speaker speaking at our commencement than Reza. Thank you. So this grace and beauty becomes particularly contrasting and prominent when it is sometime engaging with frenetic ugliness, divisiveness, hate, bigotry, and outright intolerance. Reza Aslan's name has come into prominence in the midst of ascendancy of hateful media or fundamentalist fascists disguising as liberal atheists. What Reza has been able to do, many times seemingly single-handedly, is to provide profound and meaningful historical and theological perspective to these rushed, broad-brushed, and outrightly cynical narratives about religion in general and Islam in particular. Just about the same time when Reza boldly took on these challenges, in Karachi, Pakistan, members of the Habib family, and many of them are here, started to contemplate on a similar beautiful idea. That too in the face of unprecedented challenges of violence, socioeconomic decline, and other challenges in the country. Their idea was to create Pakistan's first liberal arts and science institution. In the time when even the most optimistic predictions about Pakistan were at best frightening. But instead of repositioning elsewhere, like many people, many businesses, many philanthropists were doing in this country, founders doubled down. They deepened their commitment to this city and to this country. And here we are in Habib University, and we are, alhamdulillah, 2 days to go still to graduate our second class. That's the power of a beautiful idea. When Chris will formally introduce Reza, you will hear the scope and diversity of his impact that he has already made and is making in the realm of very important discourses in the world. But Reza's very presence here this evening is a testament of his deep commitment that he has to support any beautiful idea, regardless of 22 hours journeys packed in less than 72 hours. Reza, we are both inspired and thankful. Thank you.
So our Yohsin speaker today really doesn't need a long introduction, so I'm going to keep this very short. You all know most of his biography already. He's really one of this world's leading public intellectuals, I would say. Reza is a professor of creative writing at the University of California, Riverside. He earned his Bachelor of Arts in Religious Studies from Santa Clara University with a focus on New Testament studies and a minor in Greek. He earned his MTS, or Master of Theological Studies, at Harvard University. His major focus there was also the history of religions. He earned his PhD in the sociology of religions from the University of California at Santa Barbara. And to top it off, he has a Master of Fine Arts from really, I think, the finest creative writing program in the world, which is at the University of Iowa. Hey. He's also a television producer and a consultant for numerous programs, including the Emmy Award nominated documentary series, The Secret Life of Muslims. In 2006, Reza co-founded Boomgen Studios, the premier entertainment brand for creative content from and about the Middle East. He's a scriptwriter also. He's an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He serves on numerous boards, including the board of PEN USA, which champions the rights of writers under siege around the world. He's the author of a number of very important books. The book that really brought him to the attention of a global public was his book, No God But God, The Origins, Evolution, and Future of Islam. He also is the author of Beyond Fundamentalism, Confronting Religious Extremism in the Age of Globalism, the author of Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth, and most recently, the author of God, A Human History, which is now available in 17 languages and has been listed by Blackwell Publisher as one of the 100 most important books of the past decade. He's also edited 2 important books, one on Muslims and Jews in America, and the other is entitled Tablet and Pen, Literary Landscapes from the Modern Middle East. His talk today I think, grows out of his most recent book, No God But God, The Origins, Evolution, and Future of Islam. And I'm reminded that the great American writer Mark Twain once famously commented that God created man in his own image, and man, being a gentleman, returned the favor. So now, Reza and I have a history. In 2012, in my previous institution, I was very honored to invite Reza to be a distinguished visiting professor at Drew University in Madison, New Jersey, and Reza very kindly agreed, and he and his family moved from LA to the New York region in September of 2012 with 2 brand new twin babies, and they settled into Lower Manhattan. And very soon after that, a very large storm came. So I have some points here. So observation number one is Reza's arrival in New Jersey coincided with Superstorm Sandy, which was at the time the biggest storm to hit the East Coast. And you can see the path of that storm. It slammed right into New York and New Jersey. Reza lost power. We all lost power for like 2 weeks. So you talk about rolling blackouts here in Karachi. We lost power totally for several weeks. The subways were flooded. It was a real disaster. Observation number two. Let me get this. So all week long, Shanur is our vice president for finance, and he was sort of in charge of all of this, and we were watching the track of this storm, and I said, I think I've been through this before, right? So here's my question. So, please join me in welcoming Reza Aslan to the stage.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. True story. We're from Los Angeles. We don't have weather, and everyone kept saying this super storm is coming to New York, and my wife and I thought, come on, what's the big deal? And then suddenly it came, and yes, we were stuck in our apartment for 3 or 4 days, and then I remember on the third day, I thought, this could be serious. I should go outside and see what's going on. And I went outside, and it was like the rapture. There was nobody in New York except me and my family. And then I moved back to Los Angeles. So anyway, thank you, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Chris, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, President Rizvi and the Habib family. Thank you to all the students and the faculty here. Thank you to the Hawkeye. Where's that Hawkeye? All right. It is a great joy to be here, and I am quite honored to be the second of 5 Iranians to speak here. You should be careful about that. You invite too many Iranians, and we just stay. We don't leave. So anyway, it's wonderful to be here. There are, in the long and intimately linked history of religions, many myths of creation. There are those in which a god acts on some primal matter, and by doing so, creates form and order out of chaos. Take, for instance, the Egyptian creator god Atum, the world finisher, as he's known. Atum spent an eternity drifting along the primordial waters of creation before he finally settled upon a mound, the sacred mound called Benben in Egyptian mythology. Benben, which separated everything below from everything above. From there, he masturbated into the waters, and from that arose the first gods of Egypt, Shu and Tefnut, their children Geb and Nut, and their children Isis, Osiris, Nephthys, and Set. In some myths, creation comes through the actions of an artist or a craftsman, a god who physically creates something out of nothing. Take Napi, the creator god of the Blackfoot Indians of America. Napi was an old man who traversed the length and width of the earth, carving out valleys and rivers with his tools, planting fields and meadows, scooping up mountains with his bare hands. Sometimes creation comes quite by accident. perhaps from a divine sexual union, when Apsu, the god of fresh waters, and Tiamat, the goddess of the oceans, merged in body and soul, they birthed the first generation of Mesopotamian gods, Lahmu, also known as Mud, and his sister Lahamu, or Silt, who then birthed Anshar, sky, and his sister Kishu, earth, who then birthed Anu, the horizon, which formed the liminal space between his parents. Often, the creative act first requires an act of destruction, a sacrifice, or a murder from which the universe unexpectedly emerges. Take Fan Ku, the creator god of China. Fan Ku was born in an egg-shaped universe. Inside the egg was no thing, but inside no thing was Fan Ku, who burst from the egg as a giant covered in hair. With his chisel, he separated the earth from the sky. The earth was yin, the sky was yang, opposites yet interdependent. And then, when Fan Ku died, his skull became the dome of the sky, his blood became the rivers and seas, his bones became the mountains and the rocks, and his breath became the wind, and his death rattle became the thunder. And then there are those myths in which the creative act is intentional, when a lonesome god sitting upon some cosmic throne suddenly gives voice to a thought, "Let there be," and just as suddenly, there is. But regardless of how creation is envisioned, what most of these myths share in common is the belief that human beings were created by the gods and in their image, whether to serve them or to love them, as slaves or as equals, accidentally or on purpose, with delight or with regret. As the Hebrew scriptures say, God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. I've been studying the religions of the world for most of my adult life, and I could tell you with a fair amount of certainty that whether you believe in one God or many gods or no God at all, it is we who have given our image to God, not the other way around. Now, I don't mean to imply that there is no such thing as God or that what we call God is just wholly a human invention. I personally believe in God, but I have absolutely no interest in trying to prove the existence or non-existence of God to anyone else, for the simple reason that there is no such proof. Faith, as I never get tired of reminding people, is a choice. Anyone who tells you otherwise is trying to convert you. Faith is an experiential phenomenon, not a rational one. It is fundamentally an emotion, like love. You either love someone or you don't. And whether you do or not has little to do with reason or rationality or the acceptance of some well-argued point. No one can convince you to love someone. The same is true of faith. You either believe that there is something beyond the material realm, something real, something knowable, or you don't. If, like me, you do, then you must ask yourself another question. Do you wish to experience this thing? Do you wish to know it, however it's defined? Do you wish to commune with it? If so, then it may help, though it is by no means necessary, to have a language with which to express what is fundamentally an inexpressible idea, and that is where religion comes in. And here I think it's important to just take a moment and differentiate between what we call faith and what we call religion, because these are not the same thing. Faith is individualistic. It's mysterious and ineffable. Faith, as we shall discuss in a moment, is embedded in the brain. It is fundamentally a part of what it means to be human. For what it means to be human is to strive for transcendence, for that which is beyond. Religion, on the other hand, is nothing more or less than the language that we use to express faith. Beyond the myths and the rituals, the temples and the cathedrals, the do's and the don'ts that have for millennia separated humanity into different and often competing camps of belief, religion is simply an institutionalized language made up of symbols and metaphors that provides a means for people of faith, those who've chosen faith, to express to themselves and to each other that which is fundamentally inexpressible, the experience of transcendence. Now, there are many symbols and many metaphors to choose from. Some of these have been forged through thousands of years of conflict and contemplation. Others are quite recent. New religions arise all the time, and with them new ways of thinking about God, new metaphors, new symbols. The point that I want to make, and the point that I think is illustrated by the creation myths that I outlined at the beginning of this talk, is merely this. Throughout the entirety of the history of religions, there has been one symbol that has stood out as universal and supreme, one grand metaphor for God from which practically every other symbol and metaphor in nearly all the world's religions has been derived. And that metaphor is us, the human being. Indeed, the entire history of human spirituality can be viewed as one long, interconnected, ever-evolving, and remarkably cohesive attempt by human beings to make sense of God by giving God a name and a personality, by ascribing human attributes to God, by providing God with human desires, human strengths and human weaknesses, human virtues and human vices, even a human body. In short, by transforming God into a human being. Now, you may be sitting here thinking to yourself that this unconscious urge to humanize God may be endemic in most religions in the world, but it certainly is not in Islam. That's something Christians do. After all, unlike nearly every other creation myth and nearly every other religion in the world, Islam expressly rejects the belief that God created human beings in his image. Islam teaches that God has no image. He has no body. God is of no substance, takes no shape, no form, human or otherwise. As the legendary jurist Abu Hanifa said, quote, he, by which he means God, he resembles none of the created things, nor do any created things resemble him. And yet, the Quran is replete with anthropomorphic descriptions of God. God is described as holding humanity in his hands and having all-seeing eyes and a face. Wherever you turn, there is the face of God. Surah 2, verse 11. The Quran ascribes to God a host of human qualities and attributes, sometimes referred to as God's beautiful names, which are clearly meant to create a divine personality for a being who, if we were to take the admonition of Abu Hanifa seriously, should technically be without personality. Now, the obvious explanation for this seeming inconsistency between what God is supposed to be and how God is described in the Quran is to read such descriptions metaphorically, not as literal descriptions of God's body. Indeed, a figurative reading of these Quranic passages is not just the only rational reading possible, it is the theologically correct reading. Any attempt to read such passages literally would be a violation of the principle of Tawheed, the oneness and divine unity of God, which is the very foundation of Islam. The problem, of course, and I don't need to tell you this, is that most Muslims do not read the Quran in this way. Abu Hanifa certainly did not. As the founder of one of the 4 main schools of law in Sunni Islam, he set the precedence for Quranic exegesis by vehemently rejecting the possibility of any figurative reading of the Quran. In fact, nearly every school of law in Islam insists that God's words in the Quran must be taken literally. So, if the Quran happens to mention God's hands or God's eyes or God's face, according to Abu Hanifa, it means that God must literally have hands and eyes and a face. Never mind the doctrinal gymnastics necessary to make sense of such a view. Does God have only 2 hands? Why not 3? Why not 1,000? Would not 2 hands restrain or limit God's all-encompassing power? As Abu Hanifa's spiritual successor, Abu Hasan al-Ash'ari, the founder of the most powerful traditionalist school of thought in Islam, put it, God has a face because the Quran says so. And if such a literal reading happens to completely undermine the core tenet of Tawheed, and thus absolutely everything that Islam as a religion was founded upon, so be it. The position of these Muslim theologians and the vast majority of Muslims who to this day follow their teachings only proves just how durable our innate evolutionary impulse to humanize God can be. As I suggested earlier, and as I will elaborate on in a moment, we simply cannot help ourselves but to think this way. In fact, numerous studies by cognitive scientists have shown that whether we are conscious of it or not, and regardless if we are believers or not, what the vast majority of us think about when we think about God is not just a human being with superhuman powers, but one human being in particular, ourselves. I mean this literally. Our image of God, what we think God literally looks like, has been repeatedly proven in study after study to be little more than an idealized image of ourselves. Just this past year, researchers at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill in the United States showed 511 American Christians pairs of photos and asked a very simple question: which face looks more like God? What they discovered was that subjects automatically began constructing God's face to look more or less like their own faces. Older people made God's face older. Younger people made God's face younger. Black and Latino participants made God's complexion darker. White participants made a God who looked like someone that I could only describe as a surfer from California named Steve. Actually, it gets weirder. Self-described conservatives constructed God's face to look more masculine, while liberals constructed God's face to look more feminine. Nearly all the participants in the study, of course, constructed an image of God as a white man. We are, after all, talking about American Christians. But conduct a similar study, say in, Pakistan, and I guarantee you will see an image of a much, shall we say, browner face of God. Perhaps one wearing a military uniform. I I always have to get myself in trouble at least once. The study's conclusion is one that scholars of religion have known for years. Human beings not only imagine God in human terms, we imagine God to look and think and feel and act exactly like we do. It seems the ancient Greek philosopher Xenophanes may have been onto something when he wrote, quote, "If cattle or horses or lions had hands and could draw and could sculpt like men, then the horses would draw their gods to look like horses and the cattle like cattle." You see, it turns out that we are evolutionarily adapted to think of God in human terms. We have no choice in the matter. It is a function of our brains. In fact, if you go back to the very origins of the religious experience, you will see how the process through which the concept of God arose in human evolution compels us to conceive of God in human terms. Indeed, the concept of the humanized God was embedded in our consciousness the moment the idea of God first arose in evolution. It led to our earliest theorizing about the nature of the universe and our place in it. It informed our first physical representations of the non-material world, the world beyond ours. Belief in humanized gods guided us as hunter-gatherers, and then, tens of thousands of years later, compelled us to swap our spears for plows and begin planting instead. Our first temples were built by people who thought of the gods as superhuman beings. So were our first religions. The Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Indians, the Persians, the Hebrews, the Arabs, all of them devised their theistic systems in human terms and using human imagery. The same holds true for non-theistic religions, such as Jainism or Theravada Buddhism, both of which conceive of the spirits and devas that populate their theologies as superhuman beings. Indeed, in the larger and more mainstream Mahayana branch of Buddhism, the Buddha's appearance on earth is traditionally viewed as the manifestation of pure Dharma, but in human form. Even those contemporary Jews, Christians, and Muslims who strive so hard to profess theologically correct beliefs about a sole, singular God who is incorporeal or infallible, ever-present or all-knowing, nevertheless cannot help but to envision God in human form and speak of God in human terms. Studies performed by a range of psychologists and cognitive scientists have shown that the most devout believers, when forced to communicate their thoughts about God, overwhelmingly treat God as though they were talking about some person they met on the street. Why do we do this? What is behind this involuntary impulse that all people seem to have to humanize God, whether they believe in God or not? In fact, this is one of the more fascinating parts of these studies, is that when atheists, people who say that they do not believe there is any God, when they are forced to actually explain what they mean by God, they do what everyone does. They begin to describe a divine version of themselves. Well, the answer to this question is linked to the larger question that we're here to discuss. Why do we believe? What's undeniable is that the propensity for religious belief is inherent to our species. On this point, there is no disagreement between scholars and scientists, believers and unbelievers. The religious impulse, or what I've also called the faith experience, is so widespread, so universal, that it must be considered an elemental part of the human experience. It reaches deep into our evolutionary past. Indeed, we have ample material evidence, grave sites, temples, idols, etc., showing unambiguous signs of religious belief that date back hundreds of thousands of years before our species, Homo sapiens, even existed. So then, there is no other way to look at religious belief except as a product of human evolution. But if that is true, if religious belief is a product of human evolution, if it indeed predates the existence of Homo sapiens, then there must be some adaptive advantage to it. Otherwise, according to the Darwinian rules of evolution, there would be no reason for it to exist. For more than 200 years now, scholars of religion and evolutionary biologists alike have been racking their brains trying to find out what exactly the adaptive advantage of religion was. Why, in other words, is religious belief universal? Well, some have argued that religion arose in human evolution to answer unanswerable questions, or to help early humans manage a threatening and unpredictable world. It is an explanation for religious belief that remains popular to this day. There's no doubt that for a great many people, religion helps make sense of a mystifying and volatile existence. The question is what, if any, adaptive advantage religion would have provided primitive human beings in their early development? How exactly does offering soothing yet ever-shifting answers to the mysteries of the universe support the survival of the species? It does not. Regardless, for this particular theory to hold true, one would have to prove that there are certain emotions that are peculiar to religious expression, or that all religious expressions trigger similar emotions, neither of which is the case. One can experience the same sense of awe, the same sense of comfort, the same sense of fearlessness that so many people feel in response to religion in almost any non-religious circumstance. Actually, despite common perception, there is simply no evidence for the existence of any emotion that is utterly unique to religion, not even transcendence, and thus no reason to conclude that religious feelings are uniquely beneficial to human survival. Others have argued that religion arose deep in our evolutionary past as a kind of social adhesive, a means of fostering cohesion and maintaining solidarity and communal identity among primitive populations. I would say that this remains, to this day, the most widely held explanation for the evolutionary origins of the religious impulse. And, evolutionarily speaking, it makes a certain amount of sense to assume that by banding together and participating in a shared ritual experience, our ancient ancestors were able to enhance their collective viability and thus increase their chances of survival. But the trouble with this line of reasoning is that there is nothing intrinsically unifying or cohesive about religion. Religion certainly has the power to bring disparate people together, but it is just as efficient a dividing force as it is a uniting one. Religion engenders both inclusion and exclusion. It benefits some members of a community more than, and often at the expense of, others. It delegitimizes as much as it legitimizes. More to the point, this theory of social cohesion is dependent upon the idea that religion is the primary, most dominant source of attachment among prehistoric communities, and that is emphatically not the case. Kinship is a stronger and far more primal tool for social cohesion in our human evolution. Our Paleolithic ancestors lived in small-scale communities and extended families sharing a shelter or a cave. Their sense of solidarity, their sense of cohesion, their sense of communal identity was engendered first and foremost by birth and by blood, not by symbols and rituals. To argue that religion arose in human evolution because it gave believing communities an adaptive advantage over non-believing communities would require the existence in religion of some uniquely cohesive property that it simply does not possess. There can be no doubt that religion's communal properties allowed religion to survive throughout human history, but whether those same communal properties allowed religiously inclined humans to survive is questionable at best. Still others claim that religion's primary purpose in human evolution is to alleviate discontent, to lessen suffering and anxiety, to allay fears of the unknown. Let me just say that anyone who believes that religion's primary role is to alleviate guilt or anxiety knows absolutely nothing about religion. Under no circumstances could religion be considered intrinsically a source of comfort. Quite the contrary. Religion perpetuates as much anxiety and guilt in people's lives as it alleviates. As the legendary American anthropologist Clifford Geertz wrote, quote, "Religion has probably disturbed men as much as it has cheered them." Think about it. Religion often involves wrathful, capricious spirits whose pleasure requires back-breaking physical and psychological effort from worshipers. Evolutionarily speaking, it requires actions that carry enormous costs in terms of energy and resources, both of which would be better spent on survival and reproduction. There is a variation of this theory that holds that religion's primary purpose in human evolution is to motivate altruistic behavior, to control primitive populations and keep them from tearing each other apart. Again, it's certainly true that religion can enhance altruistic behavior between individuals, though it is equally adept at promoting selfishness. The question, again, is whether religion has a unique moral effect on society. The cognitive scientist Paul Bloom has conducted years of research examining how religion and religious belief affect moral views. His conclusion is that there is little evidence that, quote, "the world's religions have an important effect on our moral lives." In fact, study after study has demonstrated that the good and bad moral effects of religion are no more or less powerful than the good and bad moral effects of any other social practice. But even if, just for the sake of argument, one concedes that religion can mitigate the social effects of selfish behavior in a group, that still does not adequately explain how or why religion evolved in the first place. What we call religious morality played absolutely no role whatsoever in the spiritual lives of primitive peoples. Belief in a divine lawgiver who determines good and bad behavior is barely 5,000 years old. Belief in a heavenly reward for such behavior is even newer. Look, we have been asking why religious belief exists for a very long time, and the truthful answer is that we simply don't know. We have no idea. What is clear, however, and what is fast becoming the consensus among both scholars and scientists alike, is that there is no adaptive advantage to the religious impulse, and therefore no evolutionary reason for it to exist. On the contrary, religion is seen as a disadvantage in our human evolution. To quote the anthropologist Scott Atran, religion is, quote, materially expensive and unrelentingly counterfactual, even counterintuitive. Religious practice is costly in terms of material sacrifice, at least one's prayer time, emotional expenditure, inciting fears and hopes, as we talked about, and cognitive effort, maintaining both factual and counterintuitive networks of belief. And so, as Paul Bloom concludes, quote, religious belief is an unlikely candidate for biological adaptation. But if that's true, then what explains the religious impulse? Put another way, if it is true that there is no evolutionary reason for religious belief to exist, that far from it being an adaptive advantage, it was a disadvantage in our human evolution, why do we believe? Well, some of the scientists that I've quoted, Paul Bloom, Scott Atran, they have an answer. Faced with the evolutionary puzzle that is the universality of supernatural beliefs, they've come up with an innovative solution. Religious belief, they say, is not an evolutionary adaptation. It is the accidental byproduct of some other pre-existing evolutionary adaptation. In other words, there must have been some other thing that happened early in our evolution, some part of our cognitive processes that were triggered that did help us evolve, that did help us survive, and religion was just a kind of an echo, an accidental byproduct of that useful and necessary thing. Maybe. Or maybe we're just made this way. Maybe we are meant to be believing creatures. Perhaps the reason for the universality of religious belief is that we are homo religiosus, not in our desire for creeds or institutions, nor in our commitment to specific gods and theologies, but in our existential striving toward transcendence, toward that which lies beyond the manifest world. After all, numerous studies have shown that children are born with an instinctual propensity for what is called substance dualism, the belief that the body and the soul are distinct in form and nature. Understand what this means. It means that we enter the world with an innate sense that's untaught, that's unforced, and that's unprompted, that we are more than just our physical bodies, that there is more than just the material realm. That is a belief that we are born with. It is a belief that we have to unlearn. So, perhaps the origin of religious belief, the faith experience, is not rooted in our quest for meaning or our fear of the unknown. It is not born of our involuntary reactions to the natural world. It is not the consequence of our desire for communal identity. It is simply a facet of the complex workings of our brain. It is the result of something far more primal and far more difficult to explain. Our ingrained, intuitive, and wholly experiential belief that we are, whatever else we are, eternal souls inside material bodies. As I said at the beginning, there's no proof either way. Faith is a choice. However, whether you believe that religious belief is the accidental evolutionary byproduct, or whether you think it's simply a part of who we are supposed to be, how we are purposely designed, this one fact cannot be ignored. Religion and belief is first and foremost a neurological phenomenon. Whatever else the religious impulse may represent, and whatever its purpose may be, it is fundamentally a function of complex electrochemical reactions in the brain. Of course, this fact on its own is not a compelling observation, and it certainly does not diminish or delegitimize the religious impulse. Every impulse without exception is generated by complex electrochemical reactions in the brain, so why would the religious impulse be any different? Knowing the neural mechanics of the religious impulse does not undermine the legitimacy of religious belief any more than knowing the exact chemical process of love makes the feeling any less real, or the object of our affection any less worthy. What it does mean, however, is that if we truly want to talk about the origins of the religious experience, if we truly want to answer the question, why do we believe, we should look to the source of that experience, the brain. And here we return to that involuntary impulse that we began with, our innate, unconscious desire to conceive of God in our own image. It now kind of makes sense, doesn't it? After all, if belief is a function of the brain, and it is, then the very cognitive process through which the awareness of God arose in human evolution, whether by accident or according to some grand design, that very process compels us to think about God in human terms, to use ourselves as the primary model for conceiving of God. And now you know why I said that we just can't help it. We can't help but think of God in human terms. It's a function of our brains. But that's no excuse. Because regardless of whether we can help it or not, there are some very grave consequences to our natural impulse to humanize the divine. For when we conceive of a God who looks and thinks and feels and acts like us, all we are doing is projecting upon God our own best and worst attributes. We're bestowing upon God not just all that is good in human nature, our capacity for boundless love, our empathy and eagerness to show compassion, our thirst for justice, but all that is bad in it, our aggression and our greed, our bias and bigotry, our penchant for extreme acts of violence. We make God a mirror, reflecting back to us our own virtues and our vices, our own strengths and weaknesses. Our desires become God's desires, but without boundaries. Our actions become God's actions, but without consequence. We create a superhuman being endowed with human attributes, but without human limitations. And then we fashion our religions and our cultures, our societies and our governments according to our own human urges, all the while convincing ourselves that those urges are actually God's urges. That, more than anything else, explains why throughout human history, religion has been a force both for boundless good and for unspeakable evil. Why the same faith in the same God inspires love and compassion in one believer and hatred and violence in another. Why two people can approach the exact same piece of scripture at the exact same time and come away with two radically opposing interpretations of it. Indeed, most of the religious conflicts that continue to roil our world are built upon our innate, unconscious desire to make ourselves the apotheosis of what God is and what God wants, who God loves and who God hates. But it doesn't have to be like this. It may be true that we are evolutionarily adapted to conceptualize God in human terms, it is equally true that casting off this humanizing impulse takes enormous cognitive effort. But cast it off we must, for all the reasons that I mentioned earlier. I began this talk by saying that I believe in God, that it is a choice that I make. But the God that I believe in is not a personalized God. It is a dehumanized God, a God with no material form, a God who doesn't look like me, or think like me, or act like me, thank God. A God who doesn't love what I love, a God who doesn't hate what I hate, a God who doesn't share my prejudices, a God who doesn't share my politics, a God who doesn't share my race or my ethnicity or my nationality. Most importantly, a God who doesn't share my religion. A God who is pure existence, without name, without preference, without personality. A God who is, if God is anything else, quintessentially not human. I came to this God through my own long and admittedly circuitous spiritual journey, both as a scholar of religions and as a person of faith. It is a journey that took me from a spiritually inclined child who thought of God as an old man with magical powers to a devout Christian who imagined God as the perfect human being, to a Muslim who rejected Christianity in favor of a God who is singular, eternal, and indivisible. A God who is divine unity, a creator God who by definition cannot be separated from his creation. I worship this God not through fear and trembling, but through awe and wonder at the workings of the universe, for the universe is God. I pray to this God not to ask for things, but to become one with God. I root my moral choices neither in fear of eternal punishment nor in hope of eternal reward. I recognize the divinity of the world and every being in it and respond to everyone and everything as though everyone and everything were part of God, because everyone and everything is. And I understand that the only way I can truly know this God is by relying on the only thing I can truly know, myself. As Ibn al-Arabi said, he who knows his soul knows his Lord. Perhaps God did not create us in his image, as so many of the world's creation myths claim, nor did we create God in ours, as so many skeptics believe. Rather, I'd like to believe that we are the image of God in the world, not in form or in likeness, but in essence and in substance. And inshallah, it is time that we all start acting like it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Reza, for a really fascinating talk and really thought-provoking. I was thinking both about your talk and earlier we had a conversation with the faculty and the topic of this sort of current global political moment that we're in, and whether it's Bolsonaro in Brazil or Trump in the United States, or maybe Boris Johnson in England, we'll see, or Marine Le Pen in France, or Viktor Orban in Hungary, or Netanyahu in Israel, or Modi next door in India, Duterte in the Philippines. There's this newer human way of organizing ourselves, which is, of course, nationalism. And I'm wondering, as you think about this, we think about this global moment and we try to understand what's going on and why it's going on, the intersection of religion and do you think that nationalism is, in a sense, giving way to this more primordial way of humans? Just interested in your reflections on the connection between religion and this sort of new national spirit that seems to be emerging around the world.
Yeah, I think what you're seeing right now in the globe is kind of a general identity crisis. That identity crisis, I think, is rooted, of course, in the prevailing political philosophy of the 19th and early 20th century, which is the notion of secular nationalism. The idea that if we can just simply put aside our religious and racial and ethnic distinctions and instead come together as free and equal citizens of independent nation states surrounded by clearly defined borders, that if we just simply describe ourselves first and foremost in nationalistic terms, then we will finally achieve the global peace and prosperity that human beings have been looking for so long. We'll put away the wars of religion, the wars of ethnicity, and we'll have a more peaceful world. Of course, how'd that work out? Pretty good for everyone, yeah? I mean, the result of that philosophy was 2 world wars that resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of people, not in the name of religion, not in the name of race, not in the name of ethnicity, but in the name of nationalism. And I think that the post-war idea of globalization, the notion that as the world becomes smaller, those borders and boundaries that separate us into these distinct nation states will begin to go away, that notion began to conflict with this kind of new sense of how are we supposed to identify ourselves then? Okay, well, if the nation state is no longer as important in the sort of the new global order of things, okay, then how are we to define who we are as human beings? And what you saw at the sort of the end of the 20th century was the resurgence of these more primal forms of identity, religion, of course, and ethnicity. More and more people were willing to describe themselves first according to their religion and then according to their nationality. It's a complete flip of what was happening in the first half of the 20th century, where you would say, well, no, I mean, I'm American first, and then I'm a Christian. I am Israeli, and then I am Jewish. I am, Indian, and then I am Hindu. I am whatever the case may be. That has started to reverse, where you're starting to see people identify themselves by these more primal identities. At the same time, however, something else has happened, which is that, and something I think that was kind of unexpected, which is this sudden backlash towards globalization, a backlash against globalization. And that's what we're seeing in Brazil, what we're seeing in India, what we're seeing in Israel, what we're seeing in the United States. The global identity crisis that resulted from the globalization experience, the difficulty for individuals and communities to identify themselves in simple ways has caused large populations around the world to re-exert not just their old nationalist identity, but to do so in a much more muscular way. And so in the United States, what we have is this sudden surge of white nationalism. People who believe in order to be American, you have to be white and Christian. What you're seeing in India is that same notion that in order to truly be a citizen, you need to be Hindu. In order to truly be a citizen of Israel, as the Prime Minister recently said, you have to be Jewish. And so I think what we're witnessing, in my view, is not a long-term phenomenon. It is a reactionary phenomenon. It is a reaction primarily by those who, for one reason or another, feel either left behind or feel as though their sense of self, their sense of communal identity is under siege in some ways, and they are, if you will, doubling down on their race or their ethnicity or their nationality or their religion. Either way, it's an unhealthy way for individuals and societies to function. We are a multiplicity of identities. Nobody is just one thing. We are defined by a host of different factors, whether it's our ethnicity, our nationality, our race, our gender, our sexual orientation, whatever the case may be. All of those things are supposed to come together to form who you are as an individual. And if you allow any one of those things to subsume the rest, you're an unhealthy individual. And any society that begins to develop its identity solely by emphasizing one of those factors is an unhealthy society. And we're seeing the results of that, I think.
So you see it more as a kind of a reactionary thing. It's a sort of a moment. We're in this, obviously, this tremendously significant transition between one kind of global existence and another, and that this is, you see this as a kind of reactionary moment in a sense that probably is, it may last a decade or two, but it's probably a moment of sort of looking backwards in the same way that in the early industrial age there was a kind of sort of almost a kind of utopian thinking back to the agrarian sort of a desire. So you saw movements of people trying to form collectives and so forth to live, to kind of get back to the agrarian age, even after the industrial age had sort of already taken over. As this kind
yes,
of
and in the same way that there was no reversing the industrial age, there is no reversing globalization.
Right.
There is no changing what is happening here. There's no stemming mass migration. There is no cutting off of new communication technologies. Look, just think about, I just mentioned new communication technologies, but just think about the internet just for a moment here. I mean, obviously it's something that we all live with, it's part of our lives. We don't really think about it as anything other than just a simple utility. But what the internet has done is radically transform the very conception of collective identity. Look, from the dawn of humanity to about 15 years ago, the definition of community was geographically located. Community meant the people near you, whether those people were in your cave, or whether they were in your village, or whether they were in your city, or whether they were in your state, or whether they were in your country. The very definition of community meant those people around you. And, as sociologists say all the time, the concept of community was based on what we often talk about as the three S's, the materialist values, the three S's, safety, sustenance, and the other S. Safety, sustenance, security. And security is safety, and shelter. Thank you.
Shelter, yeah.
It starts with an S, but it's with a sh. Safety, safety, sustenance, shelter. Those were the three materialist values that maintain the cohesiveness of a community. We now have to talk about post-materialist values because the definition of community is no longer geographically inclined. If you are a kid in Los Angeles, you may have more in common with a kid in Jakarta because you guys like the same comic books or you listen to the same music, than either of you have in common with anyone in your actual community. And so you have an opportunity now to redefine what collective identity means. And this is something that should be celebrated, but as you can imagine, it's also really scary and frightening. And it means that who you thought you were, how you defined yourself, not so much individually, but as a collective, doesn't really apply anymore. And for a lot of people, that has created this violent backlash, an attempt to go back, right? To go back to another time when it was easy to define ourselves, because we were all white, We were all Christian. We were all the same. We all spoke the same exact language. I would come out of my house, look left and look right, and everyone looked just like me. That world doesn't exist anymore. And you can understand why, for some people,
That would be scary.
that is a very scary thing.
Could you say a little bit more about, earlier you were talking about the irony that somebody like Trump or Netanyahu, who clearly doesn't have, you know, their actual attachment to religion is less than skin deep, right? And yet they're so successful at manipulating those images. And could you just talk about a little bit about that reflection that you had earlier?
Well, it goes back to this issue of collective identity that I was talking about. You know, there are many ways to define yourself in a collective, but one of the most powerful and most primal ways of doing so is based on religion. Now, not based on belief, that's not the same thing, but based on religious identification. I mean, I don't need to tell you that people who claim the same religion don't often claim the same beliefs within that religion. But nevertheless, religion becomes a kind of shorthand for identity. So if I say I'm Muslim and you say you're Muslim, there's a connection. Now, we may sit down and realize, oh, we are quite different Muslims. We believe very, very different things. I don't like you. I don't want to be around you. But the label creates this instantaneous connection. It's a shorthand for values. It's a shorthand for identity. And politicians like Trump, like Netanyahu, like Modi, are very adept at using that shorthand to manipulate populations to garner support. Even if they themselves, again, don't share values or beliefs, simply by labeling yourself in such ways, by using the language of religion, that has the most currency for the masses, and it draws people to you in a way that other forms of collective identity simply don't.
All right, very good. Now we're going to open it to some questions for a few minutes here, and there's a basic ground rule, which is that these are questions and they're not speeches. Okay, we had the speech already, so try to keep your questions to the point and short. And we're going to go sort of back and forth. There are some, we're the people who have the mics, okay? There are several people holding mics. And let's start on the left side of the room here, and let's start with a student. Can we start with a student who's got a question? Any of our students? Here's one right here, hand up. Could we pass the mic down? Thank you.
Right here?
Yes, right here.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. So, Reza, can you please talk more about the very last point you made in this speech, that we should stop humanizing God and should instead, correct me if I'm wrong, because I wrote it after you said, should instead think of us as beings who share essence with God. So what difference does this understanding make, and how to go about doing this? Because this is an extremely new thing for me. And this is completely different from what religions and religious institutions teach us. Thank you.
Yeah, look, I think it's about a shift in perspective. As a believer, you can think of yourself as being made in the image of God. And that belief automatically turns you into a mirror for God. Suddenly, it's not just that you have the image of God, but you have the personality of God. You have the preferences of God. And that mirror starts to allow you to construct a God who is nothing more than a divine version of yourself. A God that suddenly now has all the prejudices that you have, all the preferences that you have. A God that has your very personality. And I think instead, the process of what I call dehumanizing that God gives a different kind of relationship, a one-on-one relationship. Because if you start to think about God in these pantheistic terms that I was referring to, this dehumanized version of God, then you don't see yourself necessarily as the image of God, but you see yourself as the essence of God, the substance of God. You start to dissolve the distinction between creator and creation. You start to recognize the divinity of all things and all beings. And to me, as a person of faith, it creates, I think, not just a deeper spirituality, but one that I think is more responsible, one that is less absolutist, one that is less external and externalizing and much more internal. And I think that for a great many people, it's a very difficult thing to conceive of. It's difficult for all the reasons that I was describing, the cognitive impulse that we all have. We have no choice in a matter. But it's difficult also because it drastically changes the relationship between humanity and the divine. I mean, look, part of the reason why it is so easy to think of God in human terms, to describe God in human terms, is it creates this deep connection, this individual relationship between the human and the divine, right? If you think of God in human terms, if you think of God as a divine version of yourself, then the connection, the bond between you and the divine are obvious. They're very easy to negotiate. But again, that is I think, a destructive way of thinking. Severing that connection and instead recreating it based not on form or personality, but on essence and substance is enormously difficult, but to me is a much more fruitful and much deeper form of connection and spirituality.
Very good, thanks. One on this side. Salman, do you want to?
If we are to find God within ourselves and like God in our image, what's the point of the Quran and the Hadith? Is it divine words of God, or fairy tale or stories?
I'll talk about what I think is the purpose of the Quran, but I'm not interested in talking about what the purpose of the Hadith is. The Quran is God's self-revelation. If you believe in an active, present, divine spirit, an animating force in the universe, which that's the God that I believe in, then that God is in constant communication with creation, right? The creator and creation they cannot be distinguished from each other. So there must be this constant line, this connection between the two. We think of Scripture, be it the Quran or the Hebrew Scriptures or the Gita or the Ramayana or whatever the case may be, the Bible, whatever the case may be, we think of Scripture as God's communication to humanity, usually through some kind of intermediary. I believe that that's true. I absolutely believe that Scripture can be divinely inspired. The difference, however, is that I don't believe that God communicated with humanity only once and only for a very set period of time. That an eternal God for whom time is nothing has been in constant communication with humanity. And frankly, the Quran agrees with me. When the Quran refers to the al-Kitab, that's what it means. It means that what we have with us, this physical manifestation, this physical book, is not the end of the story. It's part of the story. That if you truly believe in a divine animating presence, then that divine animating presence doesn't stop communicating, doesn't stop animating, doesn't stop being active. That's my personal beliefs. So yeah, of course there's place, not just for the Quran, but for all scriptures. These are fundamentally, as I was saying before, ways in which we form the language to actually express what it means to have this ineffable experience of faith. That's where their value lies.
And of course, Islamic theology developed the whole idea of a parallel Quran. So you have Quran al-Tadween, which is the written Quran that we know, and then Quran al-Taqween, the Quran of creation.
That's right.
And uses the terminology, ayatullah, right? So an ayah is both a verse of the Quran, but also a sign of God in the created universe. So that's a good point. So somebody on this side, if we have one of the microphones over here. Who's got a microphone? Amar? Do you have the microphone? Can we get a microphone on this side?
Yeah. Reza, coming to the conclusion and agreeing that the evolutionary origin of religion, religious impulse, is sort of coming to the fact that we are programmed this way. I wonder, why are you religious, and why Islam in particular?
Well, I'm a person of faith. I believe in God because the experiences that I've had in my life have led me to that belief. As I was saying before, faith is an experiential phenomenon. It is not a rational phenomenon, which is why I never engage in any kind of debate or argument about whether or not God exists. I find those kinds of debates to be ridiculous and useless. Faith is a choice, like any other emotion. It is a choice. You just decide based on your experience as an individual whether you believe or not. But that's just the first step, right? Okay, great. So you believe. Now what? How do you express that belief? I gave this sort of the short version of these 3 questions that I often ask in these kinds of situations, but let me just break them down for you for a moment. So you need to ask yourself 3 questions. The first question is, do you believe that there is something beyond the material realm? Yes or no? Do you believe that this is it? That the only thing that exists is that which can be empirically experienced? Do you believe that, yes or no? If the answer is yes, this is all that exists, great, good for you. You're an atheist, you're a materialist, you're probably a very happy and moral person, go about your day. If you believe no, this isn't it. There is another level of experience that goes beyond the material realm. Okay, great. Now, your second question. Does that matter to you? Do you care? Do you want to know whatever that thing is? Do you want to experience whatever that thing beyond the material world is? Do you care? Do you want to know it? No? Great, you're agnostic. Go about your day. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that view. Yeah, I believe in God, but I don't care. That's what agnosticism means. It doesn't mean I don't know. It means I don't care. That's what it means. But if your answer is, yes, I do want to know it, I do want to feel it, I do want to experience it, that's where the third step comes in. How? How do you want to experience it? And the fact of the matter is that there are a host of well-trod paths, religions, languages, symbols and metaphors that have for millennia helped people to express this feeling, to give name to it, to actually be able to describe it. Those are what we call religions. And it is helpful, if you really want to know this thing, to pick one of those. But to understand, I mean, the important thing here is to recognize that it really doesn't matter which one you pick. It doesn't matter. None of these are better than the other. No path is better than the other. They all lead to the same destination. The Buddha once said that if you want to strike water, you don't dig 6 1-foot wells. You dig 1 6-foot well. Islam is my 6-foot well. But what the Buddha understood was that the water that you are drinking from is the water everybody is drinking from. Your well is unique, but the water is universal. And the water is all that actually matters. The well is just the path. It's just the signpost. The well is the means to get to the water. If your belief is in the well, then you'll never get the water.
Yeah. I know that I personally, and when I'm here in Karachi and I look up at any electrical pole, I know that the existence of God is real. Okay, Salman, we have one over here. Thank you.
For a while, I thought you were de-spiritualizing religion, for a while. But finally, I discovered that you are going along with what Abu Hanifa said. Are you? If so, then what about the contradictions that you mentioned in the Quran about God being in the image of man?
I may have misunderstood. So I disagree with Abu Hanifa's reading of the Quran.
I see.
I want to make sure that that's important.
Okay.
On the contrary, I think that not only is it wrong, wrong is the wrong, forget that word. Not only is it irrational to read those passages of the Quran in a literal way, I think it's theologically incorrect to read those passages in the Quran in a literal way. That I think it violates the very core, the very kernel, the very foundation of Islam, which is the idea of divine unity, the notion of the oneness of God. The minute you start describing the divine in human terms, any human terms, you begin to limit that divine.
Exactly.
That's shirk. So all these traditionalists who say that the only real way of reading the Quran is to do so literally, they're the ones who are actually engaged in shirk.
So we're going to, thank you. I know some people have bought copies of Reza's book, and he has agreed to sign copies of books. We're going to conclude this portion of the program now. Did you want one final one? Okay, we have one final question, and then we're going to wrap it up for this formal part. We're going to retire. Is it nearby here? Right next door? Okay, very good. For book signing, those of you who have a book, we're going to ask you to put the name that you want on the book on a little Post-it note so that things will move faster. Once again, let's have the last question, and I'd like to have a round of applause for Reza, and then we have a small presentation that we're going to make, and then we'll move over to the books. Yeah.
Hi, Reza. Fabulous talk. Thank you so much. Reza, you mentioned, just in the earlier question also, you mentioned only two figures from the Islamic intellectual tradition, Abu Hanifa and Ash'ari, as, humanizing God. Then my question would be, which elements of the Muslim intellectual tradition did you draw upon, or if you did, to develop your particular understanding? I'd love to know who those people are.
Well, look, I mean, if I were to just say which intellectual tradition in the history of Islamic thought do I gravitate towards, the answer in the most simple way would be the Mu'tazila. But I think more importantly, it's what I always encourage people of faith whether that other is your imam or whether that other is your father. It doesn't matter. The minute you start allowing that path to be defined by somebody else, it's not your path anymore. And so that, I think, is a truly destructive form of spirituality. Someone mentioned, that she thought that maybe I was trying to take spirituality out of religion. Quite the contrary. I'm trying to take religion out of spirituality. That's really what I'm trying to do. Religion is a useful tool. Religion is a man-made, I mean that quite literally, as in men, man-made institution. It has its uses, but it is fundamentally a tool that we use. It is, as I was sort of saying earlier, it's the path to the destination, it's not the destination. But it has to be your path. Otherwise, it's not real and it's not deep.
Very good. So I'd like to ask, thank you. Ms. Jamila Habib and the president of Wasf Rizvi to come to the stage for a quick presentation. And while they're coming up, if you'd please join me in a round of appreciation for
Thank you.
Habib is representing our Chancellor, Rafiq Habib, who is a little unwell but sends his best wishes to all of you and to, of course, our wonderful speaker. Another round of applause for our wonderful Reza Aslan.
So we're going to go, those of you who have books and would like to have them signed, we're going to be meeting in this little classroom to the left out this way, okay?
All faculty members can go to the LG cafeteria for refreshments. Faculty members, colleagues, friends, Haris, friends, lower ground cafeteria for faculty refreshment. Can you inform colleagues around? And students, 2019, let's see you in LG cafeteria. Enlightened one.